All right, let's of course continue then to look at some of the by-elections, Mfundo, and see just what are they telling us about what's likely to come tomorrow. I mean, we've seen in some of places like, for example, Pongol, where we saw the emergence of the MK party, and then you can tell with, you know, that particular area that they've got a presence there. But what does it all tell us about what we're likely to see tomorrow?
Indeed, and they're very important because there have been a number of analysts that have stated that by-elections to a certain degree do give us a sense of where the voters might be looking at. So it's important to see if what we've been seeing in by-elections could possibly be reflected in the provincial and general elections. Professor, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Your views on just what we've seen, particularly in KZN, where we're seeing the emergence of the MK, and really they're showing in some instances where they would get a bit more support than even an EFF.
You know, I think by-elections for me are notoriously a little bit difficult, predominantly because, again, for me it boils down to a question around voter turnout. And what we have often found with by-elections as well, it's which party is best able to get its voters to the polls in order to go and participate in those by-elections. So I think from just a purely research perspective, one does need to be mindful that they can give us kind of a mood of which party's voters might be going out to the polls, but it does not generally present us with an entire picture.
I suppose then those who say that you look there for clues as to how things might go could potentially be mistaken?
As with everything else in life, I would say it's a 50-50. You know, we have seen, for example, by-elections happen in previous elections where political parties have had a victory for the first time in a ward, and then all of a sudden come a local government election or national election, and the pendulum then swings back and forth between different political parties. So I do think, as I mentioned yesterday as well, that quite a lot of our research and our work points to work that political parties will need to do to convince voters to actually go out to the polls. And that's why, for me, voter turnout is going to be the critical factor for these elections as well.
But then, broadly speaking, before we move away from KwaZulu-Natal, what can we attribute to the support or what many of the polls have showed could possibly be the support that the MK party gets?
It's a difficult one to answer, and I think one needs to take a bit of a historical lens in order to frame that question. So if we look historically at new political parties that have entered possibly just before an election, we often find that those new parties tend to do very well. We can trace it back to COPE, for example, in 2009. You can trace it to the Good Party as well. That has also had relatively good successes in its early days. The challenge, of course, comes in sustaining those successes. So I do think with our new political players coming in, we can see a lot of those parties do really well, but the question is going to become more long-term. What is the strategy going to be?
Speaking about strategy, I mean, we're seeing that more women have actually registered to vote. It's something we've seen in the past as well. But I wonder, do political parties actually speak to this directly in their messaging, and also how much of that do they take into account for the composition of whether National Assembly or any other government?
You know, I think from a purely a policy perspective, gender parity is obviously one of the key critical issues around our democratic agenda and kind of our democratic journey. And it's very interesting if you start looking into the psychosocial drivers and gendered drivers of voters. You will find one school of thought that would argue and say generally women are less political than what men are, but at the same time you find women being more open to donating to various social and political causes. And it's interesting for me that in South Africa we haven't really pivoted that research to really find out what are the political preferences of women, what are their political behavior. You know, we can get broad clues in our broad-based public surveys, but I do feel we do need those targeted research moving forward.
But then if we look at what we've seen now, a number of females that have attempted to head political parties don't enjoy that great amount of support. So what does it then say about women that do participate in this democracy? They're voting, but constantly it seems that more of their votes are going to men as opposed to women?
I know it can seem that way, and it can seem quite frustrating, but I do think, again, historically, if we look at kind of those gender dynamics and that the gender parity, one also needs to start looking at around questions of gender norms within a society. And South Africa is not unique, I would argue, in that case. If you take more of a global lens and you start looking at what many considered established democracies like the US, for example, women still face certain not barriers of entry, but a certain construction of gender norms that might not necessarily see them being able to fully exercise their political leadership and their political rights.
But what does it then say in some of the cases, because you still even have people who say in terms of representation, they are still kind of on the back foot. What does that mean, especially when it comes to some of the issues that pertain to women that they need to put on the table, and even not only women issues, but some of the issues that could be important for the country as well?
I can answer that question for you if you won't mind me quoting from my own research. Look, being all...
Go ahead, go ahead, by all means.
Because very often what we found when we did a study specifically around women's mobilization and participation in some economic sectors, and you will hear this across the board within your developmental narrative, your social policy narratives, your political narratives, women's visibility is being championed as kind of, gender parity. But what we found in our research that there's a very big difference between women being visible at the table and women having a voice at the table. And those are the discussions that we need to start having. That purely making women visible within a particular space, whether it be a policy space, a political space, or a social space, does not necessarily mean there is sufficient voice and agency to really start putting women's issues on the socio-political, the policy and the developmental agenda.
So we're seeing a lot of window dressing when it comes to those leaders that are females that might be pushed to the front. But would it not be a responsibility of those women, when they find out that really their voice is not heard at that table, that they need to speak up and state that this was just an exercise and I'm not going to legitimize this whole process of having me at the table when we know that my views are not valued?
You see, and I think that is where the difficulties and the nuances and the intricacies start coming in, because you often find women who occupy leadership positions have a strong voice and they are really trying to advocate and advance women's issues and put these issues on the table, so to speak. But it is very difficult for you to exercise your voice if you are not necessarily being heard. And again, that is where those gender norms within a society then starts really becoming quite important. And as you can see, it's a bit of a passion project for me. So, and I do feel that is why it would warrant maybe a nice targeted project on really finding out what are the lived experience of women leaders in positions of power.
And especially because when you think about women, Prof, and you look at the COVID-19 pandemic, they bore the brunt of, what was going on there. And at the same time, if you do not have them at the table, voicing out some of the issues and having targeted messaging to them, having their voice being heard and even being listened to and actioned at the table, you're running the risk of either leaving them behind or simply not hearing that voice that is so critical.
No, definitely, and I think there's a lot to be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic, and here I'm going to draw a little bit on our COVID-19 democracy survey that we had run between 2020 and 2021, is that women had a higher level of vulnerability, food insecurity, economic instability, economic uncertainty, financial uncertainty, and then of course also the brunt of the housework, the unpaid care work. And those are some of the conversations that we do need to start putting on the policy agenda. How do we measure women's unpaid care work? How do we account for that? And that also then goes back to our women leaders who might be mothers. They might also have their own domestic responsibilities. So how are they able then to best manage their contribution in terms of unpaid care work while also advancing their developmental and socio-political agenda?
Doctor, I want to take you back to your statement around new parties and the fact that they enjoy a lot of support at the very beginning, but it's difficult for them to sustain. I want us to get clarity as to why this is. You made an example of COPE. There have been a number of parties that cannot sustain it, but what we did see with COPE was that just quickly after those elections, there was a leadership squabble. With MK just now, they're seized with some sort of a leadership squabble. Can we attribute what then happens beyond the elections when they get this great amount of support? Can we attribute it to some sort of a power struggle that happens within the political party?
You know, I won't say, it's a little bit of both, yes and no. I would say that based on some of our party dynamic research that we have done, and quite a lot of what tends to pop up, not just for new political parties and being able to sustain their political support, but also for other smaller political parties that have grown, and have also increased their support, that at some point in time there seems to be a disagreement, not just around leadership, but possibly around what the policy directive of the political party should be. And of course you've got contesting viewpoints on that, which in turn then seems to shape different bids for leadership within these highly contested spaces. So I think for me, strategically for political parties, it really becomes an important conversation around more of a longer term plan. You know, we have a 5-year plan, but beyond that, what is it that we want to achieve within a short term, a medium term, and then maybe more of a long 15-year, 20-year term?
Quite an interesting one, Prof, and I hope we get to speak a little bit more, especially throughout the course of the week, about this, the party dynamics and how much then do they impact the electorate. Does the electorate care about it? Do they not? Because we see some of the political parties as well leaning more towards their traditional voters than they would, new ones. So how much of that actually matters for some of the voters as well?
Indeed, it will be interesting to see as the day progress, or days progress actually, how the voters have voted for their preferred parties. But thank you very much, Professor, for joining us this afternoon. That's political analyst Professor Joleen Steyn speaking to us.